Okay, this is a college advising presentation on finding a niche, how to build your passions resume, and case for admission. My name is Sam Hassel. I am the director of the Great Minds Advising team and also one of the owners at Westchester Prep. We'll first start off with a brief overview of what we're going to cover in tonight's presentation. So first off, we're going to discuss what kind of applicants colleges actually want. This tends to often be in contrast to what many students and parents believe colleges are looking for, particularly more competitive colleges. We'll next discuss how to identify your niche. So many colleges do want a student who has a more focused passion and a more focused theme around their resume that will ultimately connect to the academics that they were pursuing in college. We will be discussing how a student can actually identify what that sort of academic niche or passion is. Then we will talk about building a resume around that academic passion or niche. We will cover different resume examples from successful applicants from the 2022-2023 application cycle in order to sort of give some substance to the theory that we lay out. And then we will wrap up tonight's presentation with some key takeaways. So to start off with some context, we will largely be focusing on resume, not on metrics. So metrics are quantifiable indicators of a student's candidacy, so such as their GPA, the number of honors and advanced courses they took, their test scores, etc. These, especially at many elite colleges or more competitive colleges, and even nowadays, even top 50, top 60 colleges, these often tend not to be enough to separate the vast array of applicants that many colleges receive. There are simply too many applications that colleges receive and too few spots to admit students based only on their metrics because there are so many students who have such great GPAs, take honors courses, advanced courses, and have very good test scores. So an excellent resume can sometimes compensate for lower metrics, but oftentimes it cannot. So it's important to view metrics as what we typically call a necessary condition for admission. It is something that you typically have to have. You have to have good grades. You typically have to have a good, course rigor and advanced coursework, and you ideally would have good test scores to submit to colleges. That usually will help your case for admission, but particularly at more competitive colleges, it will not help you stand out from the applicants who also have that as well. Now, resume is often what differentiates those students who do have a lot of those factors, but it often cannot make up for a student who has a lower GPA or hasn't taken advanced coursework, etc. Resume and other soft factors matter the most for more competitive schools, as I mentioned, where top metrics are very commonplace, as I highlighted. So there are approximately 4 million US high school graduates every single year. About 50% of those students, so around 2 million students, have an A average. And that presents a significant problem to colleges as they're sifting through all these students. They need to look to other factors to differentiate them. And those are what we typically call soft factors, and resume being one of the main ones. The approach to resume building varies throughout high school. So if you have a student who is in ninth grade, their approach to resume building will often differ from a student who is in 11th grade approaching the application process. It stands to reason that a student who is in ninth grade would have more time to build their resume. They have a little bit more flexibility in terms of which direction they're building their resume toward, what sort of academics they might be pursuing in college that they're trying to, square their resume up with. And so their process will be a little bit more iterative typically, and it has a longer time trajectory. Students who are starting very late in the process and are starting closer to application time, they will have a little bit more of an uphill battle, and there will be some unique considerations for those students. The standards for students' resume will depend upon school goals. So, of course, if a student is applying to the most competitive colleges, top 10 colleges, top 25 colleges, they will be held to a much higher standard. among the soft factors, including the resume, because they will much more so need to differentiate themselves from other applicants. And the field of study will also come into play, as there are some areas of study that are very competitive, such as computer science, business, pre-med, etc. So ultimately, what standard a student's resume needs to accomplish, or what standard it will be held to, will really depend on whether the student is applying to the most competitive colleges or maybe a little bit less competitive colleges, and what area they're ultimately positioning themselves for. So what do colleges want? So one of the biggest misconceptions that we tend to face in the process of advising students, many students' families, even guidance counselors in high schools, media, etc., they tend to think that colleges are looking for well-rounded students. And I've sort of deemed this here the well-rounded artifact. I am calling it an artifact because it is not necessarily a myth. It's not something that never existed in college admissions. It was once a paradigm of college admissions to seek students who were well-rounded and had a diversity of extracurricular pursuits, but that time has long since passed. We are talking about decades upon decades ago, typically in the 80s and early 90s. You can find articles dating back all the way to the mid-90s of admissions officers at competitive schools saying that they could no longer really differentiate students who simply had great metrics and a well-rounded resume. There were simply too many of them. So ultimately, colleges seek well-rounded classes. They do not seek well-rounded students. So they are looking for a class that is ultimately well-rounded and consists of a diversity of students who each have their own unique cause, passion, niche, academic focus. They are not looking at the individual level of one student for the student to be sort of the jack of all trades, master of none. And then across the entire class that they've admitted, they will find themselves with a very enriched community that has students who are interested in this field versus that field, and have pursued this passion versus that passion. And that is how colleges ultimately want to build their student bodies and their communities. A common misconception is that holistic admissions does not equal the concept of well-rounded, or many other terms. So holistic admissions simply refers to the fact that colleges, particularly in the United States, look at a diversity of variables and factors. So they look at recommendation letters, they look at college essays, they look at the student's resume, their activities list. They consider all of these different variables, whereas in most of the rest of the world, students' sort of academic potential and where they can go to college often really just rests upon their academics and typically their test scores. And that is not the way that US admissions typically operates. It's a holistic process that takes into account a lot of different variables. But the important distinction to be made here is that even though they are looking at things such as resume and essays and recommendations, they still want to see some evidence of the student's passion for a particular academic area. Ultimately, colleges seek students who have a pronounced interest or story that fits in as one piece of the class puzzle, as I mentioned earlier. So they are looking for a well-rounded class, a diversity of interest, and each student will sort of be one piece of that overarching puzzle. And finally, a significant challenge that many students and families face is not understanding how to build a successful resume. As I've sort of deemed it, learning to speak resumes. So we have a very easy, simple language for communicating about students' metrics. It's simply math, so everybody can understand what a 4.0 GPA scale is, or a test that's graded out of 100, or that the SAT is out of 1600. And these are very easy concepts to grasp, and they're very straightforward. And so they typically get a lot of attention among many students' families, high school officials and guidance counselors, because they're very straightforward. It's much more difficult to talk about how impressive a student's activities are because many people don't understand what is actually impressive and what is not. So, a student might be participating in community service or they might be playing a sport and it's not clear to somebody, okay, what are the different levels? Does the student have to win a competition? Would that competition need to be local, regional, national? For what tier of college? What are summer programs that are more competitive and would impress admissions officers? What are summer programs that are not as impressive and don't impress admissions officers? There's sort of a very wide range of different activities and extracurriculars, and they're even within those different activity types, you also have science research internships. It's not always very clear to many students and families what sort of level a student needs to get up to, how many activities, how deep do those activities need to be, what's impressive, what's unique versus what's cliche. It is very non-standardized, and it is the part of the process that gives students really the greatest issues, and particularly if they're applying to competitive colleges. So, why is focused more desirable than an applicant who is quote unquote more well rounded? So, you will typically not hear many of these direct explanations or rationale necessarily from admissions officers themselves. I think admissions officers sort of have just accepted this general mindset, and they tend not to make it not to explicate it too often. Some of these I think are very good theories and likely to be the case, but you would often probably not hear an admissions officer directly explicate some of these causes for why they prefer students to be more focused. So number one, and even before I sort of preface some of these different speculations as to why focus students are more desirable, I will say that there is just fundamentally a quantity issue, right? So as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, there are simply too many students with all of the metrics, and that is why they need to have students who have pursued, particularly outside the classroom in their resume across these soft factors, have pursued a particular passion. And it is, again, simply a matter of just having a very small number of spots for a very large number of applicants. So number one, it's generally going to be the case that a student who is more focused in an academic area and has built more of a niche or a passion is going to have greater predictive validity typically of what that student is going to contribute to a particular field. So if you have a student who has all of the necessary metrics, they have good grades, a high GPA, they take hard classes, they have good test scores. If you add on top of that that the student has 3 or 4 very impressive extracurriculars relating to business and they plan to study business in college. So let's say that they run a pretty successful business. Let's say that they had a competitive business internship or an impressive competitive business program that they pursued over the summer in their resume. Let's say that they are the head of a business club or potentially a founder of a business club at their high school. That, on top of all of the other metrics, will really help to add to the predictive validity of the admissions officer's assessment of that student's odds of being a successful business student in college and ultimately potentially in their career being a successful businessman or businesswoman. So it helps to add more variables to the equation to sort of better predict the student's long-term potential, particularly in an academic field. It also, by a student having a greater focus in their resume and in their application materials, it presents a much more coherent application. So it's very difficult for admissions officers when they see students who are very well-rounded and they have a diversity of different extracurricular pursuits, the very typical sports, music, instrument, community service, etc. It's very hard to make sense of all of that and know what it exactly relates to in terms of the college's academics, how the story ties together. And admissions officers, in the 8 to 10 minutes they often spend reading an application upon the first pass, they don't want to be playing the role of Sherlock Holmes and sort of having to decipher themselves what this all sort of means. Why did the student pursue this club that doesn't have any obvious connection to that club, etc., etc. So it makes for a much more coherent application and what we often call application story. Third point here, too many students have a broad array of activities, so it is just simply also a matter of quantity. A lot of students try to optimize for this well-rounded paradigm, and because so many have very similar activities and they are optimizing for a well-rounded portrait of themselves, many students and many applications